I don't think that the designing agent responsible for life is an alien. I think it's a very unsatisfactory explanation. Hey, Bill Gates says DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised. Digital information, the code in DNA, points to a master programmer. It always takes a mind to generate information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form. We've got evidence of design that is pointing to a transcendent intelligence required to structure the whole of the universe itself. Richard Dawkins has interestingly said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference.
Welcome to the Truth Point Biblical Apologetics podcast, where we equip the church to discover, deliver, and defend the truthfulness and relevance of the Word of God. And we engage the culture by connecting the truth from God's Word to the people, values, issues, and ideas in God's world. 3 quick things before we get into today's podcast. Number 1, make sure that you're always personally reading your Bible and praying every single day. Your relationship with God is between you and Him. Number 2, always make sure that you're plugged into a local Bible teaching, gospel preaching, disciple making church. It's so important that you're connected locally where you are. And number 3, we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe to our content. We'd love to see God use it not only in your life, but in the lives of the people around you. Let's get into today's truth. Hello and welcome to the Truth Point Biblical Apologetics podcast. My name's Corey Pensabene. I've got with me today Dr. Stephen Meyer. He received his PhD in philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He's a former geophysicist, former college professor, and he now directs the Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture there in Seattle. And he's been on the Joe Rogan podcast, the Elisa Childers podcast, on Larry King, Piers Morgan, as well as on Ben Shapiro's podcast, just to name a few. He's written 3 books, Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design in 2009, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life, and The Case for Intelligent Design in 2013, and his most recent book, and really the launching point for our conversation today, Return of the God Hypothesis in 2021. Thank you so much, Dr. Meyer, for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Corey. Appreciate the invite.
Yeah, it's a blessing. Love having these conversations. And even as you and I were talking before we started, just it's so relevant to culture, to politics, to education, to family life, to personal, individual, factors of meaning, et cetera. So I'm really looking forward to this. Why don't you just give us a quick, for listeners here, Dr. Meyer, who haven't been introduced to you, give us a quick summary of how you grew up and how you kind of came to faith and what your journey's been like in that regard.
Oh, sure. I grew up in a kind of nominally Catholic home. We were fairly regular churchgoers for a while, and then that kind of faded. And in my teen years, I had a kind of somewhat distressed adolescence. Some of it was just stuff going on inside my own head, but with a lot of what I later learned were existential questions that I couldn't answer. I eventually opened up the big fat white Catholic family Bible, and it fell open to the division between the testaments with a picture of Jesus Christ with a very, very rugged looking Christ figure saying, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And at that point in my life, it sounded pretty good. So I started reading the Gospel of Matthew at the sort of the first chapter and found that a lot of the existential or um, uh, philosophical questions I was having that were quite disturbing to me. I didn't realize that they were philosophical. I didn't realize they were common questions. I just thought they were maybe indications that there was something wrong with me. And I started to find that in the Bible there was a kind of what philosophers call a worldview, and that the worldview of the Bible really, and the answers that the Bible was giving to worldview questions was really addressing what was bothering me. And I found that um, uh, I started then finding that there were through radio broadcasts and things, I'd hear gospel radio broadcasts from the American South. I was in Seattle, and it seemed like the only the only place there were Christians were from Oklahoma and Texas, because those are the people talking on the radio. But eventually, a Young Life group came to our town in my senior year in high school. I went to ended up going to a Christian college where I had a fantastic mentor in the sciences, and also a wonderful mentor in philosophy, both deeply Christian men. And my conversion, in truth, probably took quite a lot of time, but by the time I was out of college, I kind of settled. And it was kind of anything but a Damascus Road experience where it all happened in one big revelation. I tended to overthink everything, but I found in biblical revelation a very, first of all, the compelling person of Christ, and secondly, a a worldview, a perspective, answers to deep questions that had troubled me, that caused me to settle and become convinced that it was all true.
Mm. Yeah, I appreciate that too, Dr. Meyer, because I think, even your point about it wasn't so much a Damascus Road. I think culturally speaking, there was a season of time in our country where that Damascus Road experience was almost expected for everyone. Like a genuine conversion was marked by some sort of, this is when I got up in front of everybody
Yeah,
and did
yeah.
this kind of thing. And again, you understand why, but I think to your point, the Lord works differently in different people. And at the end of the day, it's true. And when we choose to surrender and worship, it's a beautiful thing. Now, I'm curious about this. In Return of the God hypothesis, you're arguing that theism best explains the evidence that we have concerning the biological and cosmological arguments. And then you conclude that the data, it's not just an intelligent designer. I think the way you phrase it here at the beginning of the book is that it is the existence of a personal God. So could you maybe make that, sort of introduce us here to this conversation? There's evidence for an intelligent designer, but then I think that there is a next step that goes from that to the reality of a personal God, not just a generic intelligent designer.
Right. So maybe I'll just tell a little bit of my story of my intellectual autobiography on this. Um, by kind of after first year out of college, I think I finally was settled and comfortable, not just calling myself a Christian, but I was by that time finally ready to go. I want to, you know, serve God, and I'm convinced. I've done my wrestling with God. I'm ready to find my calling and vocation. The reasons for my conversion were more philosophical than scientific.
Okay.
And a couple years out of college, I encountered um, some scientists who were first thinking about this idea of intelligent design. It was at a conference in Dallas where I was working as a geophysicist, and it was a conference about the big questions: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin and nature of human consciousness. And the conference was divided by uh, uh, in panels between theists and materialists or atheists discussing these big questions. And one of the questions that was discussed at that conference was the question of the origin of the first life. And on the panel, there were four scientists who were skeptical of the standard chemical evolutionary accounts of the origin of life. Think about the the little story you might have heard about in high school biology of the scientists who zapped the atmospheric gases, and they got amino acids to collect in the bottom of
Mhm.
the vessel, and then they imagined how the amino acids would combine into proteins, and the proteins would work with DNA to create the first cell, and it would all happen by undirected chemical processes. That's called chemical evolutionary theory. It's separate from Darwin's theory of evolution, which was a theory of biological evolution,
Mm.
which attempted to explain the origin of new forms of life from simpler pre-existing forms.
Okay.
So at this conference, listened to this discussion about chemical evolutionary theory, and was kind of shocked to find that the theists on the panel, those who were skeptical of the theory and who believed that there was some kind of, as they put it, intelligent cause evident in the complexity of the cell, some sort of intelligent cause would have been necessary to produce the complexity of the cell. it seemed to me they had the high cards in the argument, and that they were more persuasive.
Mm.
And after the conference, I met one of those scientists and began to meet with him after work hours. And he would happen to be working at a small think tank in Dallas. His name was Charles Thaxton. A year later, I was off to grad school. I ended up doing a PhD on origin of life biology. 19 years later, I ended up publishing my first book, first solo book on the evidence for intelligent design in the DNA molecule, in the molecules that would be necessary to build the first life. It was called Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design. In the book, I argued that the information-bearing properties of DNA, Bill Gates says DNA is like a software program, but much more complex than any we've ever devised or created, that those information, that the digital information, the code in DNA, points to a master programmer,
Mm.
because we know from our uniform and repeated experience that it always takes a mind to generate information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form. So if the information in DNA is relevantly similar to the information in computer code, then it's logical to conclude that perhaps there was a master programmer intelligence behind all that. And that's as far as I took the argument in the first book.
Okay.
I didn't attempt to identify the designing intelligence. I just said it needed to be a mind of some kind.
Okay.
In the next book, Darwin's Doubt, I extended the argument by showing that the information problem doesn't just appear at the point of the origin of the first life. It appears all the way up and down the fossil record.
Mm.
Whenever we see new bursts of biological innovation in the fossil record, when we get fundamentally new forms of life arising, we now know that to build those new forms of life, you would have to have lots of new genetic and other forms of biological information.
Mm.
And so again, the same kind of argument that those bursts of biological creativity require information. Information is a mind product. Therefore, when we see those bursts of biological creativity, we're seeing additional evidence of intelligent design. But again, I didn't attempt to argue that the designer was necessarily God. There have been scientists who said, well, we have evidence of biological of design in life. Maybe life was seeded here by an intelligent uh, agent from someplace else in the cosmos, some sort of alien designer. And we smile and we kind of chuckle, but then you have to stand back and realize the first person to propose that, was one of the most prominent people to propose that, was none other than Francis Crick, who was the co-discoverer of the structure of DNA. So there have been some very prominent scientists considering another design hypothesis, which is that we're talking about alien designers.
Mm-hmm.
So after writing the first two books, a lot of my readers were pressing and saying, well, very interesting, but who do you think the designing intelligence is that's responsible, or that was responsible for life? And what can science tell us about that? And that's the question that motivated the writing of the third book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. Because as it happens, I don't think that the designing agent responsible for life is an alien. I think it's a very unsatisfactory explanation for a couple reasons. First of all, that uh, any alien intelligence on another planet would have itself had to evolve
Yep.
from some simpler form of life.
Mm-hmm.
And that form of life would have required some informational input to build it, which takes you right back to the need for some primal intelligence that precedes even the alien.
Mm.
Where did that come from? The panspermia theory, that's the name of the alien intelligence designer hypothesis, doesn't ever answer that. So it just kicks the fundamental question, not down the road, but out into space. But more fundamentally, there's additional evidence of design from the very beginning of the universe. The physicists have been telling us for about 50 years now that the fundamental parameters of the universe, the strength of gravitational attraction, the masses of the elementary particles, the strength of the force that's pushing the universe apart, all of these forces and parameters are finely tuned within a hair's breadth, within very narrow tolerances, outside of which life would be impossible, to make life possible.
Mm.
And so many of those physicists have come to the conclusion that the fine tuning we see at the beginning of the universe, or since the beginning of the universe, requires an intelligent fine-tuner. And I make that argument in the return of the God hypothesis and several others, suggesting that we don't just have evidence of design long after the beginning of the universe, evidence that could, in principle, or in theory at least, be explained by some other intelligence within the cosmos. But rather, we've got evidence of design from the very beginning of the universe, and no being within the cosmos, whether an alien or we ourselves or anything else, could be responsible for the design that's evident of the beginning that makes the later emergence or evolution or even creation of those forms of life possible. So, in other words, we've got evidence of design that is pointing to a transcendent intelligence, a kind of intelligence that is required to structure the whole of the universe itself. And so that's the kind of the turn I took in the latest book, was to say, all right, let's look at this question of the identity of the designing intelligence responsible for life, and let's see if there's anything else we know that can tell us about, that can help us adjudicate the question, well, what kind of designer are we talking about? And I end up concluding that when we look at the totality of evidence about the origin of the universe, about its fine tuning, about the origin of life and the origin of the information necessary to produce it, we're looking at the evidence for a designing agent which is active in the creation. Thus, all that evidence, we have a biological design emerging at points along the timeline after the beginning of the universe, but also a designer that must transcend the confines of space and time and be capable of structuring and designing the universe as a whole in a life-friendly way. And so that's what I call the return of the God hypothesis, and that's was a long answer. So sorry.
No, that's a great answer. It's good. So let me, Dr. Meyer, let me ask you this, because as you're, especially at the end here, here's what I'm hearing you say, that the evidence isn't only just back at the beginning, but you're saying that throughout history and even into present day life, there are ongoing evidences of this intelligent designer that's transcendent, beyond space, time, matter, et cetera, that is actively continuing to have input into this. Is that the kind of the idea?
Well, I don't argue that in the either present day life or human history is showing evidence of design, although I think you can make that argument on other grounds.
Okay.
The books, I show that in the history of life, we see instances of big, what you might think of as stepwise increases, quantum jumps in the amount of biological complexity and the sophistication of the anatomical sophistication of the organisms and so forth. And so that we see not only at the point of the origin of the first life, but at other places along the timeline, as documented by the fossil record, we see evidence of innovation in the history of life, fundamentally new forms of life that would have required massive new infusions or generations of information to build those new forms of life. And since we know, since in our uniform and repeated experience, the only known cause of information is an intelligent mind, what we're seeing are instances of the activity of a designing mind in the history of life. The great 19th century paleontologist, Louis Agassiz, who never accepted Darwin's theory of evolution, and which bothered Darwin greatly, because Agassiz was probably the preeminent scientist he was the preeminent biological scientist of the late 19th century. And he said that these bursts of innovation in the history of life, the abrupt appearance of new forms as documented in the fossil record, he said, tell of acts of mind. And I basically argue the same thing in Darwin's Doubt. And so that's evidence of not a deistic creator, but some sort of creator who's active in the universe after time equals zero. Now, some of our, some of the materialist, philosophically materialist oriented scientists have attempted to save their philosophical materialism by saying, well, maybe that designing intelligence is immanent within the creation, a kind of space alien designer. And I just explained why I find that an unsatisfactory explanation, not only for the origin of life and the information necessary to produce it, but also because it doesn't explain the origin of the universe itself, but we might think of as was attested to by the Big Bang Theory,
Hmm.
or the origin of the fine-tuning of the universe, which is present from the very beginning of the universe, long before any intelligent agent of any kind could have evolved, even in theory, in the long history of the universe.
Yeah, okay, I appreciate that. That's helpful because I think as I'm listening to you, it's almost like that concept of irreducible complexity, essentially. Like you can't have organisms surviving at a certain, so maybe you could correct me on that, but that's almost what I'm hearing you say is that you can't have these life forms existing in enough to get to the place where they can even survive unless things are fine tuned to a specific set of parameters ahead of time.
Yeah, that's not really an issue of irreducible complexity, but what you said at the very end is exactly right. That there are basic parameters of physics that have to be just so.
Okay.
Uh, Gravity can't be too strong, too weak. Electromagnetism, same, can't be too strong, too weak. The two
Hmm.
forces have to be balanced in a very precise way. The masses of the elementary particles, the electrons, the quarks, can't be too heavy, too light. The speed of light can't be too fast, too slow. The rate of the expansion of the universe, same thing, can't be too fast, too slow. All these parameters fall within very, very narrow tolerances, outside of which life would be impossible. And the probability of getting all these things correct is vanishingly small, unless there is a mind selecting the correct parameters with a goal in mind, which is a life-friendly, a life-sustaining universe. And so many physicists and have come to the conclusion that the fine-tuning points to a fine-tuner, but that fine-tuning is present from the very beginning of the universe or very soon after. The parameters of physics, the laws of physics, um, the constants of physics, these things are set very early on in the history of the universe. So no being that arises long after the fact could be responsible for that evidence of design that we see from the very beginning. Instead, that evidence of design is pointing to the need for a mind that can structure the universe as a whole from the very beginning. In other words, a mind that transcends rather than
Mm.
resides within the creation.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
that's what I add. So the first books make the argument for a designing agent of some kind. The third book says, well, let's play a game of philosophical survivor, if you will. Let's look at the competing worldviews and the competing design hypotheses, and let's see which one or ones could explain the whole ensemble of evidence we have. And I end up showing that, well, whereas deism might do a good job of explaining the fine tuning, the evidence of design from the beginning,
Hmm.
it doesn't explain the evidence of discrete infusions of information long after the fact, evidence of agency acting after the beginning of the universe. The space alien hypothesis, conversely, might in theory explain the evidence of design of life on planet Earth, if you can conceive of a super smart alien tinkering in its lab on some other planet and then sending it here. But it's got other problems. In particular, it can't explain the design from the very beginning of the universe or the design that would be required to build it. Um, uh, and then we can look at other perspectives like the Eastern pantheistic view of God, which denies that there is really a conscious agency. God is more a kind of mystical union of all the elements of the creation or of the universe. But to explain what we're seeing in life and in physics, we need a mind, and the pantheistic notion of God doesn't provide that. So it's not deism, it's not pantheism, it's not space alienism. Materialism doesn't explain any of these things as a system of thought. What I conclude is that good old-fashioned Judeo-Christian theism, where that affirms a transcendent creator who is also active in the creation, provides the best overall explanation
Mm.
for what we've learned about biological, physical, and cosmological origins.
Mm. Yeah, it's good. It's profoundly deep, and I think we would expect that, right? If the Bible's really true, then we would expect exactly what you just said, because that's the way God is described, transcendently and yet involved and engaged. So let's.
Corey, can I stop you on that key word? You said expect. This is how scientists test their theories. They say, I got a theory or a hypothesis, and given some other things that I think I know, what I'd expect based on that hypothesis is certain things, certain outcomes, certain things I could observe.
Hmm.
Then I then go look at the world and I compare what I see with what I expect based on my hypothesis. If the two things are in conformity, I say, hey, that provides support for my hypothesis. Doesn't prove it, because maybe some other hypothesis is going to come along that also has the same expectation, but that's how we test ideas scientifically. Richard Dawkins has interestingly said that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we would expect if at bottom there's no purpose, no design, nothing but
Yeah.
blind, pitiless indifference. His shorthand way of talking about undirected material processes. And what I do in Return to the God hypothesis is say, okay, professor, let's talk. Is it really the case that what we see in the universe is what you'd expect based on your materialistic worldview?
Hmm.
And I show that in three key instances, it's absolutely not what we found is not what you'd expect. It's instead what you would expect if basic theism, Judeo-Christian theism, were true. And the three things that science has discovered are, first of all, the universe had a beginning.
Hmm.
Secondly, it's been finely tuned since the beginning. And thirdly, there's a massive amount of digital information necessary to build even the simplest form of life, and that arises long after the beginning. None of those three things are expected from the materialist view of reality, but they are expected from a theistic view. What's cool about the Dawkins framing is that he's basically acknowledging that you can test your worldview, your metaphysical hypothesis, the same way you test a scientific hypothesis
Mm.
by comparing your empirical expectations as generated by your hypothesis with what you see around you. And what I argue is that what we see around us is not at all what you'd expect based on materialism. And and so anyway, sorry to jump on that one word you
Good.
used, but it's a really important word in evaluating competing metaphysical systems of thought or competing worldviews. And you're right, the Judeo-Christian worldview, the one derived from the Bible, actually comports very nicely with what we see scientifically.
Mm. No, that's good. I'm glad you stopped me because these are, I think some of the times when I watch these discussions in public forums, it's often it's left in the quiet parts of closets, I think, and then when you have it in public discussions, we see someone like you, being able to actually bring that up. And most people, I think, when they're watching or listening to these ideas, unless someone highlights what you just highlighted and connects the fact that there are expectations from both sides, and that they reason based on those expectations, and that both sides, and again, I don't even know if you agree with this or not, but I think that sometimes the materialist, atheistic perspective often expects the burden of proof solely to be on those who are claiming that the Bible is true or a theistic worldview, all the while trying to escape themselves from the same burden of proof that is required for their own framework and their own expectations.
That's a very astute comment, Corey. There was a I don't know how famous it is, but I think it's fairly well. It was a prominent discussion on the BBC years ago between Anthony Flew and Alvin Plantinga. It was before Anthony Flew had changed his worldview and embraced a kind of basic theistic perspective. In large part, he acknowledged as a result of the arguments of the American design theorists, in particular about the information problem in DNA. So he had a late in life change of mind to theism. I don't know if he fully converted to Christianity or anything like that, but he had been one of Britain's most famous atheists, academic atheists. Anyway, he has a conversation pre that conversion with Alvin Plantinga, and he kept talking about the presumption of atheism, that reasonable people should presume atheism. And Plantinga, who's a very tough-minded philosopher, said, "What are you talking about, a presumption of atheism? There's no presumption of atheism. You have a worldview, I have a worldview. We both have to defend them." And it was, he kind of took he took Flew up short and said, "There's no shortcuts in this. Each side has a perspective, and you have to provide evidence and rationale and argument if you're going to persuade the other that your perspective, your metaphysical system, is more likely to be true." So, yeah, and oftentimes it's just this more of a sociological phenomenon of all reasonable people agree. And so one side, because it's dominant in the media and in the universities right now,
Mhm.
has gotten, I think, a little fat and sassy. And I've noticed this in a lot of debates, is that people assume that, that just because scientific materialism or scientific naturalism is the default worldview of the elite knowledge culture today, it doesn't really need to be defended. But it does need to be defended, and the defenses for it, I think, are quite weak.
Yeah, I agree. It kind of reminds me of that verse in Proverbs where it says, the first one to plead his case seems right until someone comes and examines him. And
Yeah,
and I think we should have confidence as born again Bible believing Christians that we can cross examine, so to speak, the witness. That if we're looking at the worldview and the ideologies of the people who are anti-theist or materialist or whatever they might be on that spectrum, I think that it's important for us to have some confidence. Let's ask some questions, because I think when we do, it allows us to see, as you're pointing out, that just because you have a bunch of bravado and just because you have the spotlight, so to speak, in culture, does not guarantee that your ideas and your reasoning
you
are
have the better argument.
reliable.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We had years ago. We were involved in a film called Expelled that was in the theaters featuring Ben Stein.
Mm-hmm.
And after the film came out, we got a call from a bereaved father whose son had committed suicide following um, the loss of his faith after reading Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion.
Mm-hmm.
And when they found, his name was Jesse Kilgore, the young man, after they found his body, they found The God Delusion under his bed. And Jesse had been sort of an on fire Christian and had gotten out of the military and gone back to school, to college. He had an aggressive atheistic professor sort of proselytizing for atheism, challenging students to read The God Delusion, mocking Christian students, that whole kind of syndrome that you often see in the educational system. And so Jesse got the book, read the book, and you could see in the margin notes, chapter by chapter, how he had gradually lost his faith, then had a kind of an ensuing sense of existential angst, and became very hopeless, and ended up taking his life. His father saw our film and called us and said, if Jesse had only seen your film, he would have known there was another side to the argument. And this is obviously a particularly tragic case. We don't blame the scientific atheists for students taking their lives. It's, everyone is responsible for those choices and all of that. And but it does illustrate that in the absence of knowing both sides of an argument, people can become deeply persuaded without maybe having the full ensemble of relevant evidence in front of them, and deeply persuaded of something that might be false, because for the very reason you're stating. My One of my supervisors in Cambridge, when I was doing my PhD, used to say, beware the sound of one hand clapping. If there's
Mm-hmm.
an argument on one side, there's bound to be an argument on the other. And if you only heard the one argument, it's very easy, as the proverb says, to be persuaded, but you need to hear the other side. And so a lot of what we've been doing is providing the other side of the argument that's been either long suppressed or not adequately developed, as scientific atheism and scientific materialism have kind of ruled the day for 100 years or more.
Mm. Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. So that's a good pivot point, I think, then, Dr. Meyer, for from here, because you had mentioned in our conversation before we really got started that this is now popping into cultural conversations. Russell Brand was the name you brought up, right? I think this conversation, Joe Rogan, of course, he's had you on, and other conversations along these lines. So maybe talk about that. Invite us into the world of maybe some understanding as to why this is now becoming forefront in our cultural and really intellectual conversations in this culture and really beyond.
Yeah, the new atheism came into fore in the mid aughts, 06, oh 07, oh 08. I think Richard Dawkins's book, The God Delusion, really kicked it off. And it was a monster bestseller, 3 million copies. And his argument was essentially that science makes belief in God untenable. Science properly understood undermines the plausibility of belief in God. And then you had other new atheist authors getting into the act. You had people like Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Lawrence Krauss with his book Universe from Nothing, which was whereas Dawkins focused on biology and Darwinian biology in particular is underwriting his atheism. Krauss focused on cosmology and the idea that you could, in his view, explain the origin of the universe from nothing at all, but nothing was in some way unstable, and that physics showed that nothing was unstable, and therefore you could explain the origin of the universe from literally nothing, and you didn't need to invoke a creator. And so this line of thinking, and also the idea that religion in general was sort of evil and wrong and destructive of Enlightenment values and that sort of thing. This was, kind of this argument held sway for about a decade or more.
Hmm.
I have a colleague in Britain, Justin Brierley, who's written a wonderful book. It's in a way a companion to mine called The Surprising Rediscovery of Belief in God. It's more about the sociological shift that's been taking place
Hmm.
and the unraveling. He tells the story of the unraveling of the new atheism, the infighting that resulted as they couldn't, because they didn't have an objective standard of common morality to which they could appeal. They're all moral relativists. Some of them went hyper woke and some went hyper anti woke, and they began to fight among themselves. And also the sense that maybe they were way overplaying their hand, definitely overstating their case. I would say Dawkins is becoming, in some quarters, a little bit of a figure of ridicule in the United Kingdom, in Britain. He just seemed a bit overwrought. And so by 2018, I ended up writing a piece in the Jerusalem Post. There was a very prominent physicist who died, Steven Weinberg, and I wrote a piece in the Jerusalem Post extolling his massive scientific achievements, his greatness as a physicist, but also suggesting that he might, with his passing, might mark kind of nadir in the development of this scientific atheism. Weinberg himself was a staunch scientific atheist. He was quoted as saying, "The more the universe is comprehensible, meaning to our science,
Hmm.
the more it seems pointless." But by 2018, in addition to the new atheists, you had some new atheists, people like Tom Holland, Doug Murray, um, um, uh, Niall Ferguson, Charles Murray, prominent intellectuals, historians, not all scientists by any means, but who were kind of Jordan Peterson, I would at that point put in that group, people who were recognizing the cultural importance of Christianity, the moral importance of Christianity, the
Hmm.
personal wisdom, the psychological wisdom in Jordan Peterson's case of the Bible, without themselves professing to be believers.
Hmm.
Some, lamenting the loss of a Christian foundation for culture, but not being able to get themselves over the line to actual personal belief.
Hmm.
This, I think, has become a very interesting phenomenon culturally. Some of those, excuse me, just one
Yeah.
second. Some of those folks have become Christians. This year, very prominent new atheist Ayaan Hirsi Ali was a sidekick of Dawkins. Has announced her Christian faith. Larry Sanger just last week, who founded Wikipedia, posted his testimony, having come to faith. He actually gave a shout out to William Lane Craig and to yours truly for some of the lectures of ours that he had seen. So, but then Russell Brand, um, Joe Rogan has shown an interest
Hmm.
in spiritual things and the God question. I was on Piers Morgan recently and was really surprised at how receptive he was to the argument that I make in my book about the scientific evidence for the existence of God, and then was later learned that he actually is a devout Catholic. And so you're just finding that some very prominent people, unexpected people, are either coming to faith or becoming more open about their faith in the culture, and the discussion of the God question, irrespective of people's perspective, is coming into our kind of popular media culture,
Hmm.
and as well as in among elite intellectuals. I would think of someone like Tom Holland, the great British historian, whose book Dominion has is in a sense an announcement of his rediscovery of the importance of Christianity. Possibly personally, he's not entirely clear about that, but
Hmm.
definitely to the whole of Western civilization and what has made the West exceptional. And I think it's a very interesting time in the culture where maybe in 2009, when you had billboards on buses saying, God probably does not exist, so you can relax and enjoy your life, courtesy of Richard Dawkins and the New Atheists. I think now we've got people very seriously considering the God question and whether or not and the possible reality of God. I think the scientific and philosophical arguments for God are contributing to that,
Hmm.
but it's I think even broader than that. There's something going on in the culture at large.
How does evolutionary ideology or atheistic materialistic ideology, how does that impact people's value systems and the way that we live? I mean, you kind of alluded to that from some of these conversations with these people. I believe, was it Richard Dawkins who just recently said he calls himself a cultural Christian? I believe.
Yeah, so I think he's understood that he might have overplayed his hand a little bit with his aggressive and somewhat almost hateful attacks on Christianity.
Hmm.
And so he's kind of pulled back from that and acknowledged that, he really does like the hymns and the cathedrals and the Christmas carols. And so he's still an atheist.
Right.
He thinks Christianity is is false. He doesn't believe that God exists, but acknowledges that Britain is historically a Christian nation and there's parts about that he appreciates and he likes. So I would say to answer your question though that evolutionary theory contributes to the plausibility of a worldview, a non-theistic worldview known as materialism.
Mm.
In materialism, every worldview has to answer the question, what is the thing or the entity or the process from which everything else comes? What's the source of everything? And theism answers that question by saying it's a transcendent creator who has a mind and creative power and in other words, a personal God. Materialism answers that question by saying, well, it's matter and energy and or materialistic processes. And one of the materialistic processes that gives rise to everything we see is the Darwinian process. So Darwinian evolution has played an indispensable role in supporting the materialistic worldview. The idea that there is no God, there is no creator, all we have fundamentally are matter and energy. And that, yes, there is a God in the idea, materialists do believe in the concept of God, but only as a concept in the mind of man. You might remember
Hmm.
that Freud said that God didn't create man, man created the idea of God.
Hmm.
Okay. So if you have a materialistic worldview where there is no God, there is therefore also no transcendent standard of morality above us all to which we can appeal. The Harvard law professor of a generation ago, Harold Berman, used to say, behind every moral proposition is the great or is a grand says who question. If you want to answer the question, all moral propositions have an ought tense. Okay, they're not written in the indicative. What is the case? They're written in the imperative. What ought to be the case?
Hmm.
And so to answer what is meant by that ought, it turns out that materialism has a very hard time explaining what is meant by ought. Theism can explain that quite readily. Ought it reflects God's design for human flourishing. You ought to do X or you ought to do Y, A, because human beings are valuable. They're made in the image of the creator of the whole universe. They're not just material stuff. Um, and I value them as the creator. So they
Hmm.
have an intrinsic value. And all moral propositions reflect underlying values. So theism could say what's being valued and who's doing the valuing. And theism can also tell you what's implied by the ought. The ought statement is a statement about how those valuable creatures called human beings should act if they are to best flourish in accord with God's design. So theism has a good account of what these ought propositions mean and what was signified by them, and it also has a basis for assuming that there is a transcendent standard of morality above us all to which we can appeal. So
Hmm.
it underwrites moral objectivism, whereas in materialism, since there's no person to value anything, no ultimate valuer, there can be no ultimate values.
Mm.
There's no person, there's no source of the moral code that's above us all to which we can appeal. Moral codes evolve in different cultures differently. They're all historically contingent, and they're thought, according to the materialist, to reflect nothing more than the intuitions or
Yeah.
inclinations that we have that were programmed into us by evolution to help us survive. Well, once you know that your moral instincts are nothing more than things that were programmed into you to help the human race as a whole survive, you personally have no particular reason to accept their guidance or
Yeah.
to abide by those moral intuitions. If
Yep.
you find that, yes, generally speaking, it's better for the human race that we not steal, cheat, and defraud one another, but it's in my reproductive best interests to take the money and run to Argentina. um, there's nothing in evolutionary ethics that says you shouldn't do that.
Mhm.
You're actually likely, to be furthering your reproductive success if you're rich and famous. So evolutionary ethics, which is the kind of practical attempt by materialists to give some account of those ought statements, really fails to ground moral propositions in anything uh, uh, objective or to provide any compelling rationale for always accepting the normative character of those propositions.
Mm.
And so you're stuck, I think, if you're a materialist, with a sort of moral relativism that none of us can actually live with. And you see that in a figure like Richard Dawkins, who is constantly scolding people about political things, or even scolding people about how immoral religion is. Um, well, that's blatantly contradictory, because in his worldview, there is no objective standard or basis for morality.
Mm.
Now, I've had an argument with Michael Shermer, who is a scientific materialist and who believes in objective morality. He's a moral objectivist, and we actually have a kind of a fun exchange on one of his podcasts that people can go look at if they want to dive deeper into that. But so I think one of the key take homes of the dominance of scientific materialism has been this pervasive moral relativism in the culture. And I think that's been ultimately pretty destructive.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you for laying that out because I think it matters. And we got to talk about this. And people, you mentioned before, mental health, emotional health, relational, social health, all these things are all offshoots, if you will, of the moral and meaning problem that we have in scientific materialism. Let me shift gears a little bit real quickly, and we'll kind of try to wind this down. I appreciate the time. How can being trained, and we talked briefly about this, how can being trained by the public education system's worldview undermine people's trust in the Bible? Meaning that, there's not necessarily always an upfront, the Bible is stupid, although I think that is in some pockets of our educational system. But just in general, as these ideas, these worldview, materialistic worldviews are pushed in our education system, how does that make it difficult and challenging for people to then defend the Bible as something viably true outside of just their faith circle and faith community?
Yeah, I think that there's a dominant worldview in the culture. We call it materialism or scientific materialism. The idea that matter and energy are the things from which everything else came. Therefore, they govern everything. Material processes, the laws of physics govern everything in a strictly deterministic way. Therefore, we don't have any agency or free will. Therefore, we're not in turn morally responsible. Therefore, also, there's no objective standard of morality, so all morality is relative. Further, there's no possibility of ultimate meaning. Things can only mean things to persons. Things don't mean things to rocks or planets or atoms, and yet we all die. So if at some point there are no more people of our kind left, there's no possibility of any kind of transcendent or lasting or enduring meaning for human achievement or human lives. There's no possibility of an afterlife. According to materialism, when you die, you rot. I'm enumerating all the tenets of this materialistic worldview, because I think it will probably resonate with a lot of people. They realize, oh yeah, I know people who think that way, or that's presupposed in a lot of what's said in the media or in classes in the universities. And so when students are taking courses in the universities and they encounter professors who have a default way of thinking at a deep level, a deep worldviewish level of thought, they very often are not being proselytized aggressively for atheism, as the young man was that I talked about a few minutes ago. But the assumption of atheistic materialism or scientific materialism, is sort of built into everything that the professor is saying.
Mhm.
And so after a while, Christian students, Jewish students, theists of whatever stripe start to feel like they're kind of the odd person out, that all reasonable people seem to agree about all this other perspective, whatever it is, whether it's in history or science, or that's been shaped by this underlying worldview of materialism. And so it starts to have a corrosive effect on the individual believer's belief system, because they don't they're not aware of any specific reasons to believe what they believe, other than it was what they were raised with. So it's
Mhm.
very important, I think, to have a more robust and confident faith that's rooted in evidence, in good reasoning. And so I used to offer a course. In fact, we did a version of it last summer in Cambridge, England, called Reasons for Faith. And I found that this has been kind of tremendously helpful to students. There are so many good reasons for faith. We've been talking about some of the good reasons to believe in God in the podcast here, but reasons to believe in the reliability of the Bible that are based on historical and archaeological discoveries, and good philosophical reasons, which were the ones that persuaded me initially about the importance of the existence of God if you're to have any objective morality or any confidence in our ability to know the world. So there's I think a very robust uh, reasoned defense of the faith available to people, and it's really important to avail ourselves and our young people of those resources, because I used to tell my students that the heart cannot exult in what the mind rejects.
Mm.
And so people will often have a very powerful subjective encounter with God, and that will carry with them for a time. But as they encounter all these pressures in the culture and these arguments against the faith from oftentimes professors in the university system, I have a colleague who calls the university system the Church of Atheism,
Mm.
and and so I think it can have a corrosive effect on people's faith over time.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's the challenge. But I think what I've been telling young people is we ought to have a little swagger. You said confidence early. There's so much evidence, and it's just really a very exciting time to be a scientist or a philosopher or an archaeologist. There's just a lot of supporting evidence, and I suppose I'm in talking to you, speaking to the choir here, because your podcast is called Truth Point Apologetics, and you and I both agree about the importance of making a case, making an apologia for faith, and teaching younger people that such good evidence and reasons for faith actually exist.
Yeah, amen. I love it, and I think that these conversations, Dr. Meyer, it's interesting because I know we got to wrap it up for time, but just the conversations are exciting to me because they're happening in the public square, like where you are, and we need to continue to have those, but they should be happening in the personal spaces of relationships and jobs and neighbors and this kind of thing. And so I think to me, I don't know if you have any advice or wisdom in relationship to that, or an word of encouragement for people to say, look, how would you charge someone who says, okay, I've got all these ideas around me. I'm kind of in the public school system. Lots of people tend to carry this materialistic mindset. What is your encouragement in terms of people just engaging with the personal relationships they have when it comes to
Well,
faith?
we always say at the Discovery Institute that we do wholesale, and we need a lot of help doing retail, to get the word out. And so every person in his or her own sphere is a very important agent of the dissemination of truth. And so the main thing is, I mean, I think that the encouragement is You don't have to go do a PhD at some snooty British university to have an impact. Um, I love Cambridge, by the way, but it's somewhat elitist. And but in your own sphere, you are the best person to influence the people around you.
Mm.
And if you need equipping in that, there's lots of material that can help with that equipping. Your podcast, I think, would be an obvious choice. But a person very dear to me began a journey of faith by reading Lee Strobel's book, A Case for Creator,
Yep.
which was a popularization of a lot of the work that my colleagues and I have done on these different aspects of these different discoveries in science that point to God. And so, that's a book to be shared, and many other great resources on different topics related to the truth of the Bible, the truth of Christianity, the reality of God. So you get equipped and share what you've learned. I think that's the formula. And of course, pray for discernment about what the person you're talking to really needs. My problem as someone trying to share my faith as a young person is I was always answering the question that the person wasn't asking. I needed to listen better. So.
Well, I appreciate that. I can certainly relate to needing to listen more to people. And the Holy Spirit, just as well as we're wrapping it up, the Holy Spirit wants this person to know God. I mean, he's drawing them. And so we get to be, you talked about being excited and having some swagger. We've got the God of the universe who wants all people to know him and to have this relationship. So we should have that knowing in the back of our minds that these people need a relationship with the Lord. Well, Dr. Meyer, it's been awesome. I appreciate so much the time, the wisdom, again, the ongoing ministry. And if people wanted to follow you more specifically and see some of your work and the articles and things like that, I've got Return of the God Hypothesis here just for those who might be interested. But where would they find you online?
I think the best place would be the website for the book. We've just done
Okay.
the Discovery people staff have done a great job creating a really nice website from which you can navigate to all kinds of great content. But the book website is returnofthegodhypothesis.com. If you can't remember all that, just discovery.org and you'll also get to us. We've got animations of what's going on inside cells. We've got debates. We've got lectures. We've got short videos that are great for young people. All kinds of content on those websites. Returnofthegodhypothesis.com.
Awesome. I'll put a link down below. And again, for those listening, thank you so much for joining us. God loves you. God bless you. Get out there and engage the people around you. Thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to point people to God's word and share his truth, shining his light into a dark and hopeless world.